Today we are entering into possibly the most famous works of art that I will show you in the course. They are by Frida Kahlo, as you know from the homework, from the film that you watched. And Frida is, like her work, perhaps one of the most well-known figures, not only in the art of Mexico, but also 20th century art in general. I imagine many of you have aunts, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, friends, someone who is a Frida fan. And today I want to walk you through not only that fandom, but really the impetus behind her work, what she did not only for herself as an artist, but for the art of self-portraiture, for still life painting, and surrealism, although in a way that is not quite as the story is usually told. We are looking at one of Frida's most famous, if not her absolutely most iconic piece, the two Fridas. Before we get into that, let's talk about the singular Frida, the live artist, woman, and person herself. She was born in 1907, though she told everyone that she was born in 1910 in order to identify herself as a true child of the Mexican Revolution, which started that same year. Because Frida used herself as the subject of her work, it's difficult to talk about her paintings without reading them through the lens of her life. That action in itself can be highly problematic. We often want to read someone's autobiography onto the films they make or onto the music that they make. And sometimes those artists are telling a story, a different story than their own. Often their own story comes to influence the stories of others that they tell. Frida's work has all of these dynamics. Okay, so as I said, she was born in 1907, and by the age of 6, she contracted polio. She spent 9 months in bed as a 6-year-old, missed a year of school, and the disease racked her right leg, leaving it forever smaller, weaker, and shorter than the left. This was the start of Frida's relationship to illness, to issues of ability, questions of the body itself. At the same time, Frida's father was a very successful photographer. He worked for the dictator's regime, Porfirio Diaz, as we spoke about last time. He photographed many of the architectural projects built by the regime. And his work is a singular showcase of that quality of European envy, in a way, or European aspirations that the Diaz regime embodied and brought to life in Mexico City and throughout the nation itself. So here's Frida growing up in a household, watching her father, the photographer, sometimes even contributing to his work, processing negatives, doing some of the daily grind that a photographer must go through in order to help support the household financially. Having close time with her father gave Frida more freedom than her sisters had. Frida's father saw in her that she wasn't like her sisters. She didn't have the same aspirations towards children and marriage and boyfriends and the kind of feminine modality of childhood in a traditional Mexican family. Frida's interest stood out. She was more interested in school. She was incredibly curious. And she convinced her father to let her study medicine. That school that I showed you in our prior class, where the muralist painted all of the walls, this prep school, really for the very most elite, had only begun to accept women the year that Frida enrolled. She was one of 35 who were accepted. Absolutely excited, full of life, eager to study, eager to try out the world. As you have probably seen and you may in fact know just from the lore around Frida. After starting her process of learning, after starting medical school and medical training, she was on a trolley in Mexico City that was hit by a bus. Her lower abdomen was punctured, really almost skewered by a metal trolley handrail. She had, as technically diagnosed, a broken spinal column, a broken collarbone, ribs, and pelvis, 11 fractures in her right leg, and a crushed and dislocated right foot, as well as a dislocated shoulder. This is the premise for where Frida's artwork comes from. It's just one part, but it sets the stage in some way for the type of work she will go on to do. It was while in the hospital that she became a painter at all, or even tried her hand at painting. Prior to, she was into book learning, she was into medicine, she was into the life in Mexico City. When her body was in this state of disarray, really after the accident, she was laid up for quite a while, and her mother brought her the pieces that you see in front of you, a palette, materials to paint on, and she had a mirror installed directly above Frida's head so that she had some subject matter, namely herself, that she could look at and reference in her paintings. If you know anything about Frida's work, there is an immense amount of self-portraiture. And that initial practice begins here in this period of surgeries, recovery, rest, and also a reconfiguration of herself. Her prospects for walking were bleak. Her prospects for a full recovery were even worse. And she had to rethink her goals to be a doctor, to be a practicing professional in the world. Painting didn't start out as a profession. It started out as a way to get through the difficulties of that time in the hospital. Other than self-portraiture, or let's say even prior to self-portraiture mixed in with it, Frida took on a very particular style of painting. We see these paintings hung here on the wall. They're ex-photos, which in a way are petition paintings. One would paint them or have them painted and bring them to a place of worship. These paintings often had very, very specific references. And for the most part, they were done by everyday people. It was not trained, skilled painters. It was a father, a grandmother, a sister, someone at home wanting something from their God and making that petition through paint. Take a minute to look at what you see above. Without reading the written description, we can see on the left that something horrible has happened. Someone has been stabbed, someone has been cut in the street. We see the man with the knife, even maybe a small sword, making his getaway. On the right, we see a petitioning, prayerful family asking perhaps of Mary or of a robed Christ figure for, is it healing? Is it justice? You get the point of the ex voto, right? It is an urgent request, and it's painted with that type of urgency. That's not to say that wealthy families didn't have them commissioned, as we see above. Here again, we see a traumatic event on the left. The family, the priest, the nuns gathered around, and then on the right we see the altar, we see the petitioning, prayerful, dutiful scene set up in this highly elaborate and skillful painted ex voto or request. Take this in for a second. You can always pause as these are going through to really spend time with the painting. I'm hoping that you'll do that. This is one of This is one of Frida's early ex photos. It's 12 by 14 inches, similar in size to the petitions that we saw hung on the wall of the church a few slides back. Here we have another intimate scene. Something different than the blatant, blunt traumas that we saw in the first two ex photos. Here instead, we have two landscapes. On the left, we have the landscapes that we have encountered in class. The pyramids, the shrines, the temples. In their foreground, these beautiful, elaborate flowers drawn with their roots. We have the sun beaming and almost shooting heat and fire out of its mouth. We have the moon. We have this energized, very archaic, an image of antiquity on the left, right? History, depth, and also life growing out of that depth. On the right, we've got the flag, so we know what's happening on the right. We know where it is. It's the United States. You can see the Ford name written over those smokestacks. We have these bizarre mechanical, industrial pieces that hit the midline of the painting. They're almost anthropomorphic, right? They have these long, extended kind of limbs moving forward into the painting. We've got the cityscape in the back. We have this kind of crazy tech in the front. And here's Frida standing in the middle. What we know of her life at the time, by this time, she had married Diego Rivera. He had commissions in New York, and she stood torn between these two very different civilizations in her mind. The rich, ancient, fertile civilizations of Mexico, and on the right, this sort of dirty, industrial, new, modern, techie place that she could not find a home in. This ex photo goes back to some of the earlier pieces we saw, some of the petition pieces where something has happened, something traumatic has happened, and there is a request, a deep request in the painting. Take a minute with it. Here we see Frida in a hospital bed, and it clearly says Henry Ford Hospital along the base of the bed with the date. And we have the scene of a very difficult miscarriage. The petition is there, the request is there, this very difficult setting, bleak, right? Somehow the hospital bed is floating in the middle of this, again, industrial landscape. It's taking place in the United States. She doesn't feel grounded. She's just floating. That figure's just floating there in the middle. And it goes back to her personal story, and this is a groundbreaking work. Even in the simplicity of the way that it's painted, in the way that it intentionally mirrors the way those retablos and ex photos looked, just simple, straightforward. They aren't painted with, there isn't an intent to show flourish and refinement in the painting style. There is an intent to convey a deep, powerful, troubling, very hard set of emotions. This is not what's happening at the time. This is 1932. This is the same time as the muralists, the work of Diego Rivera and Orozco and Siqueiros that we saw. Painting on this grand scale, these epic narratives. And here we have Frida doing something intimate, personal, incredibly tied to maternity, right? To the loss of a child. (1940) and 1938. These two pieces are part of Frida's iconic work. We have all the iconography, right? The unibrow for which she is known, which beyond just being like, oh, that's Frida. What is she saying with that? Why is she keeping those facial features? She's painting. She could make herself look any way she wanted. What we know about Frida is she actually highlighted that eyebrow. She made it even more dense. She painted in parts so that it looked thicker. She was doing that to tie herself to a particular group of women and people, to give herself a sort of fierceness in her image on purpose. And we'll look at the group of people she is building her persona around in a few minutes. But take a few minutes with each of these paintings, write down some notes, put them in Slack. What is she doing? What's happening here? What's going on with those animals? What's happening with the background, the foreground? Now when you come back, that green, leafy, jungle-like background, in painting in that sort of setting for herself, she is putting herself in the place of nature, right? The animals, the flora, the fauna. And then we have those very difficult thorns around her neck. That hummingbird no longer living. There is this sort of fertility and loss all at once in the image. Nature and culture and a constitution of the self. Something that should seem familiar in the era of selfies, right? Let's go into that in a little more detail. Frida's self-portraits carry on a tradition of self-portraiture among female artists that goes back to at least the 16th century. Here I'm showing you two pieces by Sofonisba Anguissola, who is one of the first women in the European tradition that we know of, who put herself forward as an artist taking commissions. She was born to a nobleman whose sisters were also painters, and he wanted the same for his daughter. He enabled Sofonisba's father is who I'm talking about. He enabled Sofonisba to train with the prominent painter Bernardino Campo. She was the first woman to become a socially acceptable professional artist, and her work established new conventions of portraiture for women. Let's look at what those are. What's happening in her portraits? Start with the image on the left. What stands out as you look at it? One of the first things to catch the eye are her eyes, looking out at the audience. Breaking tradition, breaking from the more common way of painting women that we see on the right, set up on her easel. There we have a mother and child. They are not looking out. They have this caricatured sense of self. Most women, particularly in Renaissance paintings around the time that Anguissola is creating these commissions, they weren't painted as particular women. Maybe a few queens, etc., could be painted as they were, but most of the time, wives, children, girls were painted as the virtues. You might see a woman in a painting and she would be chastity, for example, or she would be faith, for example. It wouldn't be Sofonisba Anguissola or Nikki Moore or whoever it is. They were always symbols instead. So Sophie is stepping out and saying, nope, I'm not a symbol. This is me. Look at me. I'm looking at you. I'm showing myself as a painter. In the right, she's showing you her trade. She's setting herself up to say, look, I can do the work. I'm doing it here. You see me doing it. It's a way of branding. It's a way of putting herself forward for commissions for the work. It's a selfie, right? Here's who I am. This is how I want you to see me. Way back in the 16th century. Anguissola wasn't the only one. There's also Artemisia Gentileschi, who comes around in 1630. Here again, right, we see that bold way of looking out at the viewer. It's almost like looking out at the camera, right, as we have recently seen as an important gesture. Here, Gentileschi is showing herself painting once again in a way that says, I'm an artist, I'm a female, and I'm an artist. What else does it say? Take some time with these pieces. On the left, breaking out of the mold of women painting women or women painting children, here she is painting a man. It's a really bold gesture. She is, in fact, holding the tools that allow him to speak or not to speak, right? By painting in that mouth. Just think about the impact of this in 1630. With that as the background, we come to the broken column painting of Frida Kahlo. Pause the video, take some time with this work. Let me know what you're thinking about it on Slack. Now that you've come back, what are we looking at? In the foreground, of course, we have Frida's body, but it's a very disturbing image of the body. Right down the middle, her body is torn in half, and there is this ancient Corinthian Ionic column in the place of her vertebrae, in the place of her backbone, her spine. It's broken, right? And this image is doing so many things. Not only is it showing us that Western, European, colonial base of strength is shattered through Kahlo. It also speaks to her own personal story, right? What happened to her body. And then we have these nails going into the skin, this crucifixion imagery, showing you with, poignant detail the pain she was going through. We see her crying like a saint, those sort of very simple ways of painting from the X photos come out again here in those just white two-dimensional tear, excuse me. The landscape is torn, it's broken, it's desolate. This is an extremely difficult and violent piece. And at the same time, it's a claim for her work. That Western tradition, that mixture within herself of her father's Spanish colonial heritage, her mother's indigenous Mexican heritage, being held together by this difficult set of straps that we know were important to her recovery, that are important to the restoration as much as was possible of her own broken body. It's a piercing image. Okay, take a breath. We'll move on to something equally disturbing. There's nothing about Frida's work that is calming, that you just sit back and feel good when you look at it. It's not meant to do that. In fact, as you see in the film about Frida's life, a very close friend said to her, "This is too much. Why are you trying to show us all of the pain that you have?" It just wasn't a way of painting. It's not what painting did. Painting showed pretty things, beautiful things, historic things. It is through the figure of Frida that we begin to see real emotional work being done in a painting, conveying an intimate level of fear, joy, love, difficulty, all the emotions, things that were nowhere near the front of mind or top of mind for the muralists, nor most other painters in the world at the time. All right, so what's happening in this piece? Again, we have two Fridas. Here, that dichotomy that is within Frida herself is fleshed out within two different female figures. On the right, we have Frida in the clothing of the women of Tehuantepec. We'll look at that location in a minute. It's a traditional indigenous mode of dress that came from the Zapotecs. And then on the left, we have this lacy white wedding dress, a Spanish traditional mode of celebrating a wedding. So that gives us a clue that the clothing on the right is also celebratory. It could be used for a wedding, it could be used for a festival. What we're seeing here is a marriage image of Frida to herself, shown through the hand holding in the middle, that connected set of veins, right? But let's look more carefully at those veins. In the right hand, she's got, what are they called? I'm just gonna call them scissors, but that's not it. There's a medical term. She has those scissors in her hands, cauterizing. Let's back up. Those aren't scissors. What she's doing is holding that bleeding vein together at the end. Not doing the best job, as we can see, because it is dripping down on her dress. But it shows us that that's a live vein or a live artery coming out of the body. If we follow that line around from the Frida on the left in the white Spanish wedding dress, up through the neck, around to the heart, back over to the image of Frida in the clothing of the Tehuana women, down and around to that right arm, Frida's holding something small in her hands. Can you see what it is? It's an image of Diego. The story of their marriage, their relationship, often clouds Frida's own work, and I'm not going to go into it in detail here. You've seen the film, you know the impact. You read the pages that I've assigned. We have this healing, Frida reconciling her two selves, her split self within itself after the divorce with Rivera. It's an image of the struggle inside oneself. Again, she's not telling the story of an epic historical journey of Mexico the way that Rivera's murals do in the National Palace. Instead, she's telling a very intimate story of the reconciliation of difference within the nation, within herself. It's nothing today. We have a lot of moody, surrealist work that you feel like, I'm seeing everything you're feeling right now. It's a little bit TMI, but this is new on the world stage. It is absolutely novel. So far, We have Frida recreating or getting within the tradition of retablos and ex-votos. We have her carrying on the tradition of self-portraiture for women as a way of putting themselves forward as artists. Frida also reworks the very nature of still life. So many of Frida's still lives deal with nation, with Mexico itself, through the very fruits that it shows. And they often also deal with fertility, death, loss. Here we have this kind of butternut squash in the center, right? Cut, sliced through so that we can see all the seeds and that, all of the squiggly stuff inside the squash. And then we have this kind of mushroomy thing that looks like lots of little hands coming up on the left. And as those hands reach into the butternut squash, right, we get this image of the fallopian tubes, the uterus. Here, Frida is rethinking still life in its very human and embodied meaning. Okay, on to the thing that most of you know about Frida if you have ever encountered her before. It is her clothing. So many women have taken on this kind of what they now see as a bohemian image of a feminist and early way of self-expression and Mexicanidad, right? With all of its color and shape and form and flowers. Frida takes on this image herself. This wasn't the traditional clothing of the time in any way. In the 1930s, 1940s in Mexico, people are dressing like they are in the 1930s and 1940s in the United States or in Europe at the time, right? Dresses, suits, this kind of way that we think about the 20th century. Because of her illnesses, because of the struggle with her body itself, Frida had to modify a lot of clothing. Because of the shortened legs, she wore very thick boots that had one leg had a thicker sole than the other so that she could walk evenly, so that she would stand with her hips in alignment. And years and years and years of surgery, successful and failed attempts to repair the body that was injured in that trolley accident, often left her in a body cast, as we see her on the left. Those things are not going to fit well into blue jeans and a button-down shirt. They just aren't. And in order to work around that, and as part of the same gesture that Frida makes when she says, no, I'm born in 1910 instead of 1907, this way of identifying herself with the revolution in Mexico, this way of identifying herself with one of Mexico's early peoples, this is what's happening in her clothing. Her friends weren't wearing this. No one's wearing this stuff. She instead takes on the clothing, not really even of her mother, but possibly of her grandmother. And in detail, what we're seeing on the right here in this spectacular self-portrait where she, has herself kind of, she looks like either the center of a flower or the top of a cupcake, something crazy going on. This is a traditional headdress of the Tijuana women. Let's finally get to who they are. Tehuantepec is where you see the point here on the map. It's in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. This is an image of the city of Tehuantepec, the Tijuana women, in their celebratory clothing. This is a festival. They are dressed in their finest, their best, their most elaborate. But you see many of them with those white almost veils coming off and up above their head. The Tehuana are descendants of the Zapotec. They were able to fight and isolate themselves against Cortez, against the Spanish colonial invasion. The name Tehuana is synonymous with the word wild animal. And this comes from the ferocity of their warriors, their ability to fend for themselves and to fight off the colonizers. They are a matrilineal society, so everything is passed down through the woman. When Diego Rivera came back from Europe, when the Secretary of Education, Vasconcelos, decided he wanted to teach the people through bold, brilliant murals on walls, he first brought those artists to Tehuantepec to remind them of who Mexico's people are, who they were before Spain, who they were before the Spanish arrived. This is the place where the iconography, the images of ancient Mexico come from. We see it in the work of Diego Rivera. You'll now recognize that top. You've seen it in Kahlo's images and paintings. And we see it here in this collection of her clothing. This collection itself, right, speaks to the icon that Frida Kahlo became. And this is thanks in large part to the work of the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Mexico City. There weren't like Lady Gagas of the time, people who self-styled and made themselves into icons in the way that Frida has done. Seizing on the draw of her work, the director of that museum began to make reproductions of some of her most famous pieces, those two Fridas in particular. This also wasn't done. Now you can get a coffee cup, you can have a pillow printed with anything you want on it. But at the time when Frida's work was going viral, this sort of thing just wasn't done. You had one special hallowed painting that only one person could own and have in their homes. To reproduce it was thought to really dull down the light, the specialness of that piece, but he did it, and it's part of why, it's almost definitely why we know about Frida today. The mass circulation of her image reached all of us in the United States, around the globe. It's a real interesting question, this of the singular, almost sacred image versus its dispersal. And if you have more interest in that, there is a theorist named Walter Benjamin who does a lot of great work on that. Frida's work is often discussed, her work is often discussed as part of the Surrealist movement. We'll get into who the Surrealists are later in the class. Frida rejected this. She took part in a famous exhibition in Mexico hosted by André Breton, the head of the Surrealist movement. But she didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as expressing something truly personal and truly Mexican all at once. The Surrealists had a different agenda. So we'll end with this image of Frida painting Frida, as we saw in Gentileschi and Anguissola's work, here near the end of her life, showing herself, with her doctor. In the image, right, she has created the image of the doctor himself. There's this fascinating layering just in this photograph. There's a lot to be read, thought about in Frida's life. And there's a lot out there if you're interested. And there are lots and lots of incredible women also working in Mexico, creating incredible art, photography, painting. who go unnoticed. Frida takes the spotlight, and I even hesitate to teach her in class, except that I think many people would feel like something was lost if we didn't cover the most famous Mexican artist. Okay, that's the end for today. I look forward to discussing with you next class. Take care.